Last week, Israel and the United States carried out joint exercises simulating an attack on Iran. In your assessment, how likely are these countries to launch a military operation against Iran? In that scenario, would Iran undertake a preemptive strike?
In the name of Allah, the most beneficent, the most merciful. We have children in Iran who like to play pretend, acting as if they were grown-ups. But it's all in their imagination. That's the only way to look at these war games by the Israelis and the Americans. All they do is pretend to act out their daydreams. Deep down, however, they know that no military can harm the Islamic Republic of Iran. They understand very well that the hand of the Islamic Republic is raised to strike at the Zionist regime and at Israel. So rest assured that they will not dare use the military option against the interests of Iran. At the same time, the Islamic Republic is prepared to defend its interests in the region and will respond with a strong counterattack against America and the Zionist regime.
Could you please comment on the reports that Iran has started construction of a new nuclear power plant in the west of the country? How are you planning to use the energy produced there? Will the facility be open to international inspectors?
Peaceful use of atomic energy is a globally recognized practice. We are an official member of the International Atomic Energy Agency. Several months ago, we signed a protocol with the agency regarding inspections, and we did that voluntarily. Enrichment of uranium by Iran was authorized under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Like all members of the IAEA, we're entitled to use this peaceful energy to drive our country's progress. The agency is well aware of our work. A few days ago, we even informed IAEA inspectors that we'd produced uranium enriched to 60%. We are in no way violating international laws or IAEA regulations, which is what we told the inspectors.
Yes, but the West has its own way of seeing developments like these. In their eyes, it's always some kind of a threat. Is the Iranian government concerned that this move could further strain relations with the West? Or has Iran already given up hope for constructive dialogue with the Western nations, let alone a return to the nuclear deal?
We have a saying in Iran, a smart man wouldn't jump over the same hole twice. At the JCPOA negotiations, we did our best to reassure both the European countries and the US and to alleviate their concerns about our advances in the peaceful use of the atom. And how did they respond? They did not honor a single commitment they had made. People around the world seem to think that it was America alone that walked back on its promises after Trump came to power and withdrew from the JCPOA. In truth, when it comes to keeping one's word, the Europeans are just as bad. After Trump left the White House, the Europeans had us believe they would take America's vacant place with respect to nuclear commitments. But in reality, not only did they fail to take America's place, they also reneged on their own obligations. America is not a nation that seeks truth. America disrespects international law. From America's perspective, the language of international relations is that of power. Today, the US is making the argument that it is more power than everyone else, which means that all international conventions, laws and agreements must only be used as part of America's own agenda, at the expense of independent nations. In the past 43 years, we've come to know America well. We've seen what it's capable of. The one thing we've not experienced in our dealings with the US after the revolution is honesty. Consider this, many of our neighbors in the region have no such thing as democratic elections. Until a year or two ago, women were not allowed to drive cars. But in the Islamic Republic, women are actively involved in all spheres of life. You can see it for yourself. Yet we still get accused of, as they put it, human rights violations, etc. In other words, America only recognizes one truth. You can do whatever you please, as long as you do it under America's banner. It has been 43 years since we stepped out from under that banner.
Is Iran planning to shift away from its partnership with Russia now that Tehran has come under pressure of sanctions imposed by countries like Canada as punishment for allegedly supplying arms to the Russians?
What do you think my job is as head of Iran's Commission of National Security and Foreign Policy when it comes to our relations with Russia? We don't need some country's permission to develop our partnership with Russia or with any other nation for that matter. The one thing that's important to us, the only thing that guides Iran's policy, is that our national interests. For many years, we've enjoyed close relations with Russia, and in recent years, we were able to make even more progress. This year, Russia's esteemed President Vladimir Putin had 4 meetings with our president, His Excellency Mr. Raisi. President Putin met twice with our supreme leader. Iranian and Russian ministers and officials hold regular meetings, go on reciprocal visits, and conclude agreements beneficial to both countries. This is a clear indicator that Russia and Iran are aimed to establish strategic cooperation, both in politics and security and economically. Russia is a massive country. Iran, too, has considerable potential. If we were able to combine our needs with our respective strengths, it would surely be of the greatest benefit to both our nations. Then neither Russia nor Iran would have any reason to worry about America or some power-hungry European nations. Over these last few years, as I met with Russian officials, I saw there is a lot of potential will in Russia to make that happen. I felt that in the words and statements of my Russian friends. I've seen their commitment to strengthening relations with the Islamic Republic with no conditions or limitations. In no way do we recognize American and European sanctions against Russia. We view them as unjust. We ourselves have just been subject to unilateral US sanctions for 40 years. Russians know more than anyone how well we handle these sanctions. Over the years, we've unlocked a potential that would never have been available to us were it not for the sanctions.
Do you think this dialogue with Iran will be continued? Will the EU and the IAEA be able to lift at least some sanctions in the future? Is there hope? What do you think?
Sanctions are an instrument that America and Europe use to exert political influence on independent countries. The same happened to Russia. Obviously, it was sanctioned for pursuing its national interests. The same can be said about Iran. Officially, we do not recognize these sanctions. The nuclear deal talks reached to a certain point by the end of last year. We reached some agreements with the Americans, but when the next year started, they didn't express much desire to continue the talks. We believe that America and some European countries like the UK, France and Germany are behind the events that have been taking place in Iran over the last couple of months. We'll definitely respond when the right time comes. At this point, I don't see any possibility of a positive outcome for the nuclear talks. We don't want to go back to the negotiating table right now and discuss our nuclear program with America and the European countries. If they're going to respect our national interests, they should stop meddling in our internal affairs. After that, we can continue the nuclear deal talks. Right now, I don't see any clear future for these talks. Iran doesn't really care about the sanctions. Positive changes happened under the new government, economic growth, new solutions in the economy. All these transformations don't have anything to do with the nuclear talks. Economy and foreign policy have different paths. We have achieved certain economic results during the past year, and if, God willing, they continue, we'll be able to relieve the economic difficulties in our country.
What makes you say that the West is behind the events in Iran, and what sort of response are you talking about?
First of all, the Americans hinted that this would happen in Iran. The BBC and their international service broadcasting from London are supported by the UK and America. Germany initiated the anti-Iran resolution in the UN, but they're violating international law. Yes, Germany is basically the author of the UN's anti-Iran resolution. And to think that German companies supply the Saddam Hussein regime with components for chemical weapons during Iraq's war with Iran. Those chemical weapons were used against our troops and civilians. Our people still have the scars from the wounds of that war. They attacked one of our cities with chemical bombs, and it was the Germans who supplied Saddam Hussein with components for chemical weapons. The CIA and Mossad have admitted in their reports that they are vulnerable and couldn't deliver one powerful blow to destroy Iran. So they decided to use the tactic of thousands of small cuts. Just listen to the interviews of Israeli and American officials. They are clearly meddling. The US Secretary of State, even the President, support the rebels in Iran. I have a question for you and your audience. Can you name any part of the world where dozens of police officers were killed in street riots, like in Iran? There are about 8,000 wounded and injured law enforcement officers. Look at the Yellow Vest protests in France. About 30 people were killed and none of them were police. And there were only a handful of officers among the 1,500 injured in France. In Iran, on the other hand, dozens of police and security officers were shot from lethal weapons. The counter-revolutionary forces in Iraq's Kurdistan that threaten our national interests arrive and join the protests, organising riots in some of our cities. They have the full support of Israel and America. I don't even know what other evidence you need. I think it should be pretty obvious to your audience that America and Israel secretly support the riots in our country. The Mujahideen organisation that is active in America and Europe advocates the overthrowing of the Islamic Republic. We've detained a number of its members in Iran, and they admitted that they were involved in such activities. All these people, members of these groups, killed 17,000 people in our streets not too long ago.
You mentioned that you are working on some sort of response to the West's meddling. Can you talk more about that?
We responded with sanctions to the European sanctions. For the first time, the Islamic Republic was sanctioned by European countries, and it responded. If they sanctioned our citizens and companies, we do the same to their representatives, politicians and media organisations that have become part of the conflict through the riots. Some complaints are voiced in the format of international organisations. The UK has a media regulator that issues licences. It's not news for you that in Europe, media outlets, Instagram and social media cannot promote violence. If any of them somehow let publish an instruction on how to make a Molotov cocktail, which is an incendiary compound, they'll get blocked inevitably. Our embassies were attacked in 11 European countries. These Molotov cocktails were thrown at our diplomats. We've filed claims against those countries under the Vienna Convention to the international institutions about their failure to honour their legal obligations regarding the territories of the Islamic Republic of Iran, our embassies, diplomats and other affiliates. This is the free world they promised to the international community. They also want to free us. What if somebody decided to free them? They'll face their colonial past. America, an entire nation that's existed for nearly 300 years. Just look at what they've done to Africans, to Native Americans. Canada as well. It's introduced sanctions against Iran and Russia. Only recently, mass graves of Canadian Indigenous people's school children have been discovered. Nobody even cared to apologise. A few days ago in an interview, Canadian school children, Indigenous people, burial sites, mass graves, Canadian officials never apologised. I've seen an interview of the Prime Minister where he said he ordered the police to treat harshly protesters who blocked streets and that he approves such measures. They'd better focus on solving the energy crisis that will only aggravate this winter rather than interfering in Iran's domestic affairs. And also abstain from burning coal for heating, as it would greatly pollute the environment.
When the protests in Iran started, media was telling that the Iranian government turned to Russia, asking for help in stabilizing the situation. Is it truly so? And if it's true, why Russia?
In fact, there are no grounds for such speculations. Russia's Security Council delegation came to Tehran on a scheduled visit. Our enemies, the Western media, distorted the facts and tried to take advantage of the visit. They rushed to portray the visit as a meeting to convey some information on security and riots in Iran and other such lies. We've grown used to it. It was a scheduled visit that had nothing to do with the protests. We discussed the security issues of the region, including the situation in Syria, Afghanistan and Yemen, as well as our nuclear program and bilateral security issues. Our agenda was so tight we simply had no time nor opportunity to discuss the situation in Iran. Americans are concerned about bilateral meetings since they know what this means better than anybody else. Mutual visits and high-level meetings undermine the interests of the US. That's why they try to trick the public into believing the reason for the visit was Iran's internal affairs.
So why, in your opinion, it would have benefited them for the public to believe Iran asked Russia to help?
I've recently explained that. They've spread rumours recently that the Supreme Leader's health was getting worse. Before that, after the Ukrainian crisis broke out, they said President Putin was ill and his days were numbered. These are fake news you could only laugh at, and I see you smile. They wanted to deceive the world and prevent the global media from covering this visit correctly. We had so many matters to attend, we simply had no opportunity to address the protests. And the Russian side also didn't express any wish to bring up this topic, so it wasn't included in the talks. The events of the last 2 months didn't really gain much momentum. It's the Western media that tries to stir it up. Iranian people will brave this storm. Our government has a solid footing and people's support, so that people can handle any protests and critique on their own. Our high-ranking officials said on more than one occasion that they will welcome constructive criticism for the benefit of Iran.
And what steps is the government taking to stabilize the situation after the protests? And is it true you're going to dismiss the morality police? Is there a grain of truth in this news?
Look, we could have solved all our problems our own way, if not for the Western interference and their media domination. Not a single sphere of public life was hampered by these events. Over the 2 or 3 months of the protests in Tehran, the nation continued to develop as nothing had happened. Just as our supreme leader wished, all public institutions and ministries continued normal operation. To answer your question, I'll say this. One of the objectives of the United States was to impede development of the Islamic Republic of Iran. With God's help and our people's support, that plan has failed. The situation in Iran is currently stable. In some areas and cities, there is still mild protests underway, but everything is under control of the law enforcement. As for the morality police you've asked about, it was just a way to implement the law, and there can be different ways. If the government decides to make changes to the ways the law is implemented, it's our internal affair, and it's something we can take care of. This isn't anything to be concerned about. I would like to tell you as well about the entire Russian audience and anyone in the world that Iran's conflict with the United States is not about the morality police. The core of the conflict is that we are different civilizations with different views of the world. The US wants to turn the world into a unipolar global democracy with liberal values. But countries like Iran won't give in to the liberal and democratic pressure. We have our own governance and political system. And if Iran has a domestic issue, we will address that issue internally. And we do not need American intervention. I want to recap that the tensions between the US and Iran for the past 43 years have not been about the nuclear program or the human rights or the rights of women or the morality police. The true reason is that the US is looking for a lackey. They want a loyal regime in Iran, the kind Mohammad Reza Shah was. They want Iran to bow and say to them, "Your wish is my command." But this is not going to happen. The people of Iran made their choice during the Islamic Revolution and freed themselves from the American yoke.
Of course, it's your culture and your laws, but I'm sure that many of our viewers would like to know if the morality police is going to be cancelled and whether there will be any change, or you rather plan to keep it the way it has been until now.
The morality police in Iran is nothing extraordinary that's worth discussing on TV. It's merely doing of the Western media. I was hoping to discuss here on RT things that really matter, such as our bilateral relations and global issues. I'm going to be absolutely straight with you. What we need to do now is think about the new world order and what role Iran and Russia will play in its significant powers. The US realizes it looks at possible isolation in the new world because the opposition to the US-led unipolar world is growing, and that's inevitable. America is interested in us discussing minor issues such as the morality police in Iran or in Russia or any other thing, as long as we stay away from these serious global problems, which is why I hope that the Russian media can recognize this hybrid war, mind game trap that they're pushing us into for what it is and focus on the bilateral and global issues that really matter.
Oil is a very important issue, especially at the time of the global energy crisis we're experiencing right now. How important are oil exports for Iran today? Do they account for a large share of the country's income? And what is your take on Iran's oil on the international market? How's it working today?
It is clear to the world that Iran has been gradually reducing its dependence on oil trade. And it's one of the blessings in disguise Iran received thanks to the sanctions. In absence of sanctions, Iran would have no reason to look for other ways to make profit. Iran's oil exports have been sanctioned for many years, so our oil sales have been going down, which gave us a unique opportunity to build our economy all over again and find new ways to raise funds for the state budget. Iran's R&D intensive companies are the benefactors of this process. They've been developing and now enjoy strong economic relations with many countries in the world. The United States wants everyone else to see the US and a few European countries weighing as much as the rest of the world, but we don't think so. We consider Russia and China major players too. We're very fond of Latin America and promote our cooperation with it actively. Any country of the world tries to maintain good relations with its neighbours. Iran borders on as many as 16 countries. How can one sanction a nation like this? So we went on developing other industries instead of the oil business. As you can see, despite the sanctions, Iran has been successfully administered and making progress. Surely, if all the sanctions were to be lifted, our economy would thrive. But it doesn't mean that as soon as the US lifts the sanctions, we will shake its hand and give up our own interests. I think it's clear to the US now that all these sanctions have failed to work and that it's better to engage in a dialogue with Iran. The only reason President Biden brought up the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action again is because sanctioning Iran didn't work. If Russia stands its grounds, you'll see that in the end they will approach you and revisit their own views on sanctions.
That remains to be seen, of course, so we'll have to see how it goes. If it doesn't, we'll have to think of something. Iran surely has a wealth of experience of living under sanctions and staying the course despite the pressure. Thank you very much for this interview.
I would like to say just one more thing. The time has come when the world is no longer in America's hands, but in the hands of many independent nations and states. And with God's help, we need to be strong and stick to the agenda that is in the interests of our nations. Thank you. Thank you. Many thanks.
Thank you very much.